Hi, everybody. So this week we are covering two really kind of big topics. We're covering the Progressive era and we're covering World War I. And these topics have actually a lot to do with each other, not just because they occur at roughly around the same time. The World War I occurs kind of right in the middle of the Progressive era, but they also have connection kind of, thematically as well. The Progressive era, as we're going to see in this lecture, was really all about reforming society and kind of idealism and reform. And that very same idealism and reform leads the United States, at least in part, leads the United States into World War I. And World War I, the outcome of the war, kind of marks the end of the Progressive era. So that's kind of why we're covering both of these topics together. So I'm going to talk first about the Progressive era. And the Progressive era, the big questions that we have for progressivism was, what were the motives of the progressive reformers? What were the goals of progressive reformers? How did they attempt to reach those goals? And what role did women play in the progressive movement? Progressivism was, if anything, a very contradictory movement. It was very incoherent. Invariably, if some progressives believed that they could improve society in one way, another group believed that they could improve society by doing the exact opposite thing. But there are some general characteristics that define progressivism. Progressives were concerned about the effects of industrialization and the conditions of urban industrial life. All of these social problems that were created by industrialization that we've been talking about over the past few weeks, this was something that progressives noted at the time. They realized that society needed some reform, and they were very concerned about the social ills that were caused by industrialization. They were really trying to humanize and regulate, in particular, big business. That was kind of one of their main focuses. They wanted to use government to reform society. They had kind of this fundamental optimism about the possibility of progress, the capacity of individuals to solve problems. And so they were willing to very much intervene in people's lives, either through private charity or through government. But they turned more and more to the authority of the state and government at all levels, the local level, state level, and at the national level. So they really wanted to use the tools and the power of government to reform society. They also had an enormous amount of faith in the benefits of science and human expertise. They believed that they could understand and control the environment in which people lived, and that they could use scientific principles, the scientific method, to better society. They had a commitment to improve all aspects of American life. The progressive movement had a national reach. It had a mass base. It appealed to many different kinds of people. There was no single issue or concern that united progressives. But in general, they believed that a better world was possible. They had kind of an optimistic outlook, and that progress depended upon knowledge and experts using that knowledge to better society. So the progressives stressed individual morality and collective action. They stressed the scientific method, and they stressed the value of expert opinion. One of the first tasks of progressives was to expose the social ills that they felt needed to be remedied. So in the first few years of the 20th century, we see a variety of American journalists and novelists and artists and critics setting out to do just that, to expose the problems of society. And they were given the label Muckrakers by Teddy Roosevelt in 1906. Roosevelt was somewhat critical of the Muckrakers. He disliked the fact that they, were so mired in trying to expose the social problems. He felt sometimes that they were kind of just digging up dirt for the sake of digging up dirt, and that they ignored some of the good things going on in society. But he also was a strong supporter of Muckrakers when he felt it was warranted. He said, "There are in the body politic economic and social many and grave evils, and there is urgent necessity for the sternest war upon them. And he said there should be relentless exposure of an attack upon every evil practice. And he said, I hail every writer or speaker, every person who on the platform or in book or magazine or newspaper exposes these things. And he said the men with the muckrakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society, but only if they know when to stop raking the muck. So Roosevelt was the one who came up with this term, muckrakers, and it kind of stuck. These muckrakers tackled a number of social issues, including questionable economic practices, racial violence, the treatment of the mentally ill, patent medicines, chronic unemployment, child labor, unsanitary conditions in industry, urban poverty, corruption in big business. And we have to think about, well, why was muckraking so popular and successful? Why was this kind of a phenomenon during this era? Well, for one thing, it was made possible because there was this kind of new publication format happening in American literature. There was this magazine revolution that was going on in the late 19th century. So these magazines started to have kind of a national audience. And instead of depending upon individual subscribers to cover the costs of production, these magazines began to be financed by advertising, and that meant that they could reach a mass audience. So one of the leading muckraking journals was McClures Magazine. And McClure, Samuel McClure, he was the publisher of this journal, and he realized he could almost give away his magazine for free and still make a profit just from advertising. So in 1893, he began publication of McClures Magazine, and it sold for 15 cents a copy. So this was widely affordable for a lot of people. And it touched off an immediate price war among his competitors. And so muckraking appears just when magazines start to enter the average home and they start to become a really popular form of literature and reading. The muckrakers they very much appealed to kind of traditional American values. And they were very much concentrated in urban areas. Muckrakers, of course, they exposed corruption everywhere, but they concentrated on urban corruption. And the cities, of course, had always been a place where there was, a certain amount of corruption. But the muckrakers, really maintained that something new was going on here, that business had grown dominant and it was supporting this crooked government. And they argued that that there needed to be kind of a return to kind of traditional, more kind of small town American values. So the muckrakers were one kind of aspect of progressivism. I'm going to talk about a few other kind of, reform efforts of the Progressive era. One of the most famous reform efforts of the Progressive era was the passage of legislation designed to protect public health and specifically to regulate the nation's food supply. And this reform arises directly out of a muckraking novel by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, and it was published in 1906. And if any of you have ever actually read the book, it's an interesting read. If you've read it, you'll know that it's not just about the disgusting conditions in the meatpacking industry, even though that's what most people remember from it. Sinclair actually intended his book to be an expose of the lives of working class Americans, and he considered them to be almost kind of working under slave-like conditions. And so he wanted to kind of expose the despair and the, sort of the horrible conditions that they were working under. But Americans who read this book, they largely ignored this argument, and they focused upon his descriptions of these graphically disgusting conditions in the slaughterhouses. And this really showed all of the corruption that was going on inside the meatpacking industry. And as a result of the publication of The Jungle, foreign sales of American meat fell by 1/2. So the meatpacking industry was facing an enormous crisis. So in order to calm public outrage and to demonstrate that they were trying to kind of reform things, the major meatpackers actually lobbied the federal government to pass legislation paying for additional inspection and certification of meat packaged in the United States. Now, Sinclair kind of lamented later on that he said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." And so, sort of what kind of results from Sinclair's book is not necessarily a, reform of kind of the labor of the people working in the meatpacking industry. It was more, sort of the products of the meatpacking industry itself. One of the people who read The Jungle was the progressive president, Teddy Roosevelt, and after reading it, he orders an investigation. And the conditions that the investigators described were just revolting. Roosevelt was so concerned about the impact of this report on the industry, he initially didn't release the findings for publication. And instead, he ends up, sort of kind of hinting at what was in the report. He kind of alluded to the disgusting conditions and the inadequate inspection measures. And by 1906, through the cooperation of Roosevelt and Sinclair and the meatpacking industry, Congress is able to pass the Meat Inspection Act. And this sets rules for sanitary meatpacking and required government inspection of meat products. Now, a second measure, the Pure Food and Drug Act, was helped along by another muckraking author, a guy named Samuel Hopkins Adams. He wrote sensational articles for another one of these muckraking magazines about the dangers of these patent medicines. And at the time, there were all kinds of, so-called miracle cures being promoted, often, by very dubious individuals. Mostly, sort of these so-called miracle cures were mostly, basically just alcohol. Sometimes even other illicit drugs like opium was put into these medicines. And so the Pure Food and Drug Act was also passed by Roosevelt in 1906, and it required manufacturers to list certain ingredients on the labels, and it banned the manufacture and sale of unsanitary food and drugs. So that was kind of one of the more famous episodes of muckraking articles and novels actually leading to reform. Now, of course, Sinclair had set out to expose the conditions, the dangerous and the deadly conditions in many factories and workplaces throughout the country. He's not terribly successful because everybody seizes upon the fact that their meat is, got, all kinds of gross stuff in it. But this, improving working conditions was another area that progressives attempted to tackle. As machines and assembly lines were speeding up, disasters became increasingly likely, and the terrible danger of working conditions was really brought home to the entire country in 1911 when there was a fire at a factory, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, it was a company that occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building in New York, and it employed around 500 workers. Most of these workers were young immigrant women from places like Italy and Eastern Europe. Some of these women were actually not even women. They were, girls, 12 or 13 years old, and they worked these really long hours, 14-hour shifts. Their work week was maybe anywhere between 60 to 72 hours. And they ended up sewing, what they did was they were sewing clothes for a wage of about $1.50 per week. Now, the conditions of this factory were very typical of the time. There were lots of flammable textiles stored throughout the factory. There were scraps of fabric all over the floors. There were patterns and designs on sheets of tissue paper hanging above the tables where the women were working. Smoking was, of course, very common at this time, and there was no, electric lighting. Illumination was provided by open gas lighting, and there were no fire extinguishers in these factories. So, on the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, a fire began on the 8th floor. It was sparked by either a lighted match or maybe a cigarette. To this day, no one knows whether it was actually intentional or accidental. Now, the workers on the 10th floor and the 8th floors, they were able to find out about the fire in time, and most of those on those two floors were able to evacuate. But the warning about the fire on the 9th floor didn't reach the 9th floor in time. And the 9th floor had only 2 doors leading out. One stairwell was already filling up with smoke and flames by the time the women realized that the building was on fire, and the other door had been locked. It had been locked ostensibly to prevent workers from stealing materials or taking breaks, and also to keep out people who were trying to organize the seamstresses into a union. So one door is blocked by smoke and flames. The other door is locked. The single exterior fire escape, which was a very flimsy, poorly anchored iron structure, soon ended up collapsing under the weight of people trying to get out. And the elevator also stopped working, and so that cut off that means of escape. Panicked workers actually tried to save themselves by jumping down the elevator shaft to land on the roof of the elevator. And realizing that there was no other way to avoid the flames, some of the women ended up breaking the windows and jumping to the ground 9 stories below. Others ended up prying open the elevator doors and falling down the elevator shaft. And very few people actually survived these falls. And it was very difficult for the fire department to actually get to the building because there were so many people who had jumped out of the windows and died on the street below. The remainder of those who were trapped in the building ended up, basically burning to death until smoke inhalation or fire overcame them. And the fire department arrived, but they were unable to stop the flames because there were no ladders available that could reach beyond the 6th floor. So the death toll for the Triangle Shirtwaist fire ended up being 146. And this was a very shocking incident to the American public. People were just outraged at this, and they demanded reform. And as a result, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union started working with local government officials and also progressive reformers. And they were able to push for comprehensive safety and workers' compensation laws in the wake of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. One way that we can look at the progressive movement is to really recognize that many of the most vocal and active and famous progressives were women. And this represented a growing trend of women beginning to challenge social norms. They were beginning to move outside the home and into the public sphere. So women were very active in progressivism. They pushed for higher wages. They pushed for better working conditions, improving the lives of the urban poor, abolishing alcohol and prostitution, distributing birth control information, and safeguarding children and women in the workplace was a major concern, as was also education, ensuring pure food, improving living standards in their communities. So these were all issues that women really cared about, and women became very active in the progressive movement as a result. One of the big issues for women was combating child labor. In 1880, over 1 million children were employed in the United States as part of the paid workforce. And the number was actually much larger than that because 1/2 of the nation's children lived on farms where labor was expected and, mostly unpaid. You were working for your father or your grandfather or, some relative of yours. So you weren't being paid for your labor, but you might be working all the same. By 1900, that number had been cut to only 284,000 children having jobs beyond home and farm. And so the result of these efforts to combat child labor was a dramatic increase in literacy. More children than ever began attending public school during this era. The rate more than doubled between the end of Reconstruction and the start of World War I. And the number of public high schools increased from just 100 to more than 6,000. So progressive era reforms, they sought to really restrict the employment of school-aged children, to get those children out of the factories and into public schools. Local anti-child labor organizations succeeded in passing laws limiting child labor in at least a dozen states. These laws weren't always enforced, but they did help to reduce the number of children who were killed or injured in industrial accidents. One group was the National Consumers League. This was an advocacy group that sought to end child labor and other abusive practices by informing consumers about the working conditions under which the products that they were buying were being made. The woman who was the leader of this group was a woman named Florence Kelley, and she traveled around the country documenting the conditions of working women and children. The National Child Labor Committee was organized in 1904 to push for legislation and to lobby Congress to outlaw child labor. And one very famous labor leader, a woman named Mother Jones, she ended up leading marches of children, which, like you can see here down on the corner here, displaying banners asking to be allowed to go to school. Now, these efforts to pass legislation on the federal level, they ended up, getting stalled really until the Great Depression, when Congress ended up passing to these laws in order to protect jobs for adult men. But in 1912, President Taft, under pressure from the National Consumers League and the National Child Labor Committee, he established a Children's Bureau within the Department of Labor. And this Children's Bureau ended up pushing for measures to protect children in the workplace. So this was another big issue that women really got involved in. One progressive era woman who was challenging a lot of social norms was a woman named Margaret Sanger, and she really led the crusade for birth control during the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, birth control was a very controversial issue. A lot of very religious people, both Catholic and Protestant, opposed its violation. They saw it as a violation of sort of God's will. Others feared that it might foster promiscuity. And legislation had actually been passed in the late 19th century that banned the distribution of birth control information via the U.S. mail. By 1914, 22 states had enacted laws restricting the distribution of information about birth control. Now, against these opponents, a woman named Margaret Sanger, she really sought to promote birth control. Sanger was a young wife and a mother in New York City in the early 20th century. And she did not find being a wife and mother terribly fulfilling. She ended up getting involved with a group of, sort of people in Greenwich Village in New York, which was really a hotbed of kind of radical ideas at the time. She met a number of socialists there. She joined the Socialist Party. She worked to organize women and marched in labor picket lines. And she ended up pursuing a nursing career, and she began working in neighborhoods in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And largely these were tenement housing. And she was very much surprised by the ignorance of the women in these neighborhoods about their own bodies and their own sexual health. And so in 1912, she wrote a series of newspaper articles about sexually transmitted diseases and personal hygiene. And these articles ended up being banned from the mails. She saw these poor working women being really burdened with unwanted pregnancies and occasionally dying from self-induced or back alley abortions. And so she resolved to try to do something to help these women. So she actually was the one to coin the term birth control in 1914, and she set out to promote understanding and practice of birth control methods. She spent a year learning about contraceptives. She began publishing a journal about it. She urged women to, sort of get out there and speak, sort of speak their minds. And she really tried to raise kind of the social consciousness of women. Her journal ran for only 7 issues before it was banned by the post office, and she was actually indicted under this federal legislation that prohibited people from distributing birth control information in the mail, and she actually ended up having to flee to Europe for a time. She very much believed that birth control was a medical issue, that it belonged in the hands of physicians and their patients. And that physicians should be free to prescribe contraception when it was appropriate, and that women should decide for themselves whether they shall become mothers, under what conditions, and when. And so she began to work to try to broaden the base of her birth control movement. She came back to the United States when the government dropped its indictment against her. In 1916, she again defied the law, and she opened the nation's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn. The police raided her clinic. She was arrested. She went to jail, and she didn't stop there, though. She didn't let it stop her. In 1921, she organized the American Birth Control League, which held clinics and conferences to educate the public. By the 1940s, every state, with the exception of Massachusetts and Connecticut, had legalized the distribution of birth control information. And of course, the American Birth Control League later became the organization known as Planned Parenthood. So Margaret Sanger was really instrumental in kind of challenging social norms at the time and kind of, advocating for working class women and advocating for women's control over their own bodies. Another group of progressives, many of them women, were also interested in helping these working class women and immigrants. They were the settlement house workers. Settlement houses were institutions that were set up in the slums and tenement neighborhoods, where middle-class reformers, these educated women mostly, also some men, would go and they would live and work alongside local people. Now, this movement, the settlement house movement, started actually in England, and it was, he was the one to kind of, it was started in England. A man named Stanton Coit was the first to kind of import the idea of settlement houses, a place, sort of set up in the slums that would provide community services. And he brought this idea back to the United States in 1886. He set up a neighborhood, guild in New York's Lower East Side. The most famous of these settlement houses was probably one, however, started by a woman named Jane Addams. That was called Hull House, which she set up in Chicago. Now, these reformers, they basically wanted to bring education and culture and middle-class values to these working-class areas. Many of the workers in these settlement houses were women, and they were very often college graduates who wanted to put their knowledge and their talents and their energy to good use. Jane Addams was probably the most famous example. She was well-educated. She had graduated from college, but she found that there weren't very many opportunities out there for a college-educated woman. And so she went to Europe. She was from a fairly wealthy family, so she could travel to Europe, and she actually visited one of the famous settlement houses there in England, and she got inspired to set up her own settlement. She came back to the United States, and she and a friend of hers from college, a woman named Ellen Gates Starr, they set up Hull House in 1889. Now, at its height, Hull House was visited each week by around 2,000 people, which was a small fraction of about the 70,000 who were actually living in the neighborhood, but it was a pretty substantial number. And it included all kinds of social services for these immigrant communities. It had a night school for adults. There were kindergarten classes that were set up. They had clubs for older children, kind of boys and girls type things where they could go after school. They had a public kitchen to help feed people. They set up music schools, drama clubs, a library, all kinds of things just to provide these kind of, necessary services for the community. And her kind of institution of this adult night school was actually very influential because it kind of sets the stage for continuing education classes that are offered by many community colleges today. Settlement workers, they did more than just provide social services, though. They also studied the social composition of the neighborhoods. And in fact, these settlement houses were very much important sociological institutions. They provided a lot of information about life in these poor and working class neighborhoods. And so they were very influential in that regard as well. Another area that women were very much involved in was the temperance movement. The temperance, or the anti-alcohol movement, had been active really for a very long time, since the early 19th century. And it was a movement that many women became actively involved in because it was kind of closely associated with the traditional female sphere, the home. The home and the family were regarded as kind of the legitimate terrain ruled by women. And because men who drank were very poor husbands, they were poor fathers, they couldn't provide for their families, women got involved and became very involved in attempting to curtail the consumption of alcohol. And so in the fall of 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded. It was known as the WCTU. And it became actually the largest women's organization in the country. It had a membership of 150,000 women by 1890. And this group attracted mainly Protestant middle-class women. Their motto was moderation in all things healthful, total abstinence from all things harmful. So the WCTU, it may have started out as an anti-alcohol organization, but it very quickly moved to broaden its program of reform. Alcohol abuse was considered to be the root of a whole host of other social problems, including things like poverty and domestic violence and crime. So the WCTU became involved in other issues as well. They were active in the labor movement. They were active in combating things like prostitution, in promoting public health and sanitation, and also in the suffrage movement. The WCTU and its head, Frances Willard, they pushed for suffrage for women as part of their reform. They were instrumental in organizing women's suffrage leaders and in helping more American women become involved in politics. And they argued that, sort of women needed the vote to act as, sort of responsible citizens and protect their homes and their society and, help combat some of these social ills that they saw going on. So the WCTU was, sort of very active in that regard. Women's suffrage, of course, was part of the Progressive era. It predates the Progressive era. It goes all the way back to 1848, just like with the Temperance movement. It kind of goes back to the mid-19th century. But the movement itself, the push for women's suffrage, had been divided over tactics, really since the Civil War. There wasn't a lot of unity in the movement initially, and after some years of division, the two major suffrage organizations in the U.S. merged together in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, this group was a relatively conservative organization. They wanted to work to push for suffrage through lobbying and kind of peaceful legal protests. Other groups, though, other mainly younger women, were a bit more radical, and they formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. The leader of this group was a woman named Alice Paul, and she and her friends in the Congressional Union were much more militant. They interrupted public meetings. They focused their attention on Congress rather than on the states. They ended up picketing the White House. They got themselves arrested. They went on hunger strikes while they were in jail. They were really trying to draw attention to the movement and to kind of, push in a much more radical way for reform. Now, suffragists, the argument for women's suffrage had really changed since the early 19th century. Before, women suffragists had argued that the vote was a natural right, that it was owed to women as well as men, because women were, citizens of this country, they were human beings, they should be granted the right to vote. Now, the women's suffrage movement started stressing a more pragmatic argument. They started arguing that since women were more sensitive to kind of moral issues than men, that they would use their votes to help create a better society. And this argument attracted a lot of people who believed that bringing women into the vote and allowing women to have the vote would help to kind of purify American politics. In 1920, all of the struggles of the women's suffrage movement paid off with the passage of the 19th Amendment, which we're going to talk a little bit more about next time when we get into talking about World War I. Now, progressives, they almost universally wanted to use government to accomplish their goals of reforming society. But in order to do this, they had to reform government itself. They wanted to curb the influence of special interests. They wanted to make government more effective and efficient. They wanted to make government follow the public will. And sometimes their efforts to do this kind of governmental reform were a little contradictory, as we're going to see. Now, in general, progressives, they wanted to reform government to make it more efficient and effective and responsive to the public. They created new government agencies to address particular social problems. And of course, this had the effect of enlarging the size of government at all levels. The new posts that were created in these agencies were to be staffed with experts, trained individuals who would be best equipped to solve these social problems. And so the result of this kind of governmental reform was really an expansion of government power at all levels, at the local level, at the state level, and even at the national level. So on the local level, reformers worked to reorganize and reorder municipal governments, city governments. They created urban reform leagues, which formed kind of a professional, non-political civil service. And the goal here was really getting efficiency and results. They turned to recent advancements in business management and organization. They said, we are the experts. We know how organizations should be run. And they created things like regulatory commissions and, city managers. They wanted kind of nonpartisan expertise. So they were really trying to, in large part, get rid of the kind of graft and corruption that you see with these kind of, with the kind of, things like the Taft ring and these, examples of corruption that we've seen in cities. In another effort to make, another way that progressives tried to kind of reform government was by democratizing it, by making it more democratic, by reducing the power of politicians and increasing the influence of the electorate. And this largely happened on the state level. There were three measures that were, designed to make elected public officials, more responsive to the public will. So a number of states passed things like the initiative, which allows voters to propose new laws, the referendum, which allows voters to reject or accept a law that's been passed by the legislature, the recall, which allows voters to remove elected officials from office. Another kind of effort to make government more democratic, all but 3 states during this period passed what was known as the direct primary, which meant that voters were the ones who got to choose who would represent their party in elections, rather than having kind of party officials do it. So establishing direct primaries. And then in 1913, you had the passage of the 17th Amendment, which calls for the direct election of U.S. senators. Up to this point, U.S. senators had been elected by state legislature. So again, these are efforts to kind of put more power back into the hands of the voters. Progressives wanted to get government out of the hands of these corrupt career politicians and political parties, and there were a number of different ways to go about this. One way to do that was to put government in the hands of the experts. So instead of having a city mayor who would be, elected by the public and who might serve in a very corrupt administration for a long amount of time, they would do things like bring in city managers and say, we're no longer going to have a mayor. We're now going to have the city run by a manager, and take the power, away from these elected officials. Another way, of course, is to make government more democratic by putting more power into the hands of the voters. And these two methods are somewhat contradictory of each other. Government by experts takes power away from the corrupt politicians and the parties, but it also takes power away from the ordinary people. And so looking at the governmental reforms of the Progressive era, we can really see how the Progressive movement was a really diverse and not entirely unified effort. Like I said, Progressivism was sometimes contradictory. If one progressive wanted to accomplish the goal of making government more efficient and effective in one way, another had a completely opposite way of doing that. But they had the same goal. Now, even though a lot of the progressive reforms took place at the local and the state level, the problems that were facing the country, things like poverty, economic instability, the waning democracy, these are national problems and they demand national solutions. And so during the Progressive era, we see 3 successive presidents from both political parties attempting to address those challenges. And these are known as the Progressive presidents. The first of these was, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. He comes into office in 1901. After William McKinley is assassinated. He is very active and vigorous president. He does all kinds of, progressive era reforms. He breaks up the trusts. He pushes for more federal regulation of the economy. He's very famous for kind of working towards conservation and the conservation movement and conserving America's natural resources. His successor, William Howard Taft, who served as president from 1908 to 1912, he was more conservative than Roosevelt, but he was still known as one of these progressive presidents. He pursued antitrust policies. He supported a graduated income tax with the 16th Amendment. Now, we get to the election of 1912, which is kind of an interesting election. In this election, Roosevelt decides he wants to run again. And he decides Taft has not been, a very effective leader of this progressive movement. And so Roosevelt and Taft end up battling it out for the Republican nomination. Now, when Taft wins the nomination, Roosevelt says, okay, I'm going to take my ball and I'm going to start a new progressive party. So he runs actually as a third-party candidate in 1912. And his platform of the Progressive Party brings together many of the different competing strands of progressivism. It's actually very progressive. Roosevelt and Taft end up splitting the Republican vote, not surprisingly, and that allows for the election of the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. Now, even though Wilson's a Democrat, that doesn't mean he's not a progressive. He's very much a progressive. He expands the power of the federal government. He creates things like the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Trade Commission. He passes a number of other reforms. It's under his watch that we see the passage of the 19th Amendment, allowing women's suffrage. It's under his watch that we see the direct election of senators. So we get to see a lot of these progressive era reforms kind of reach its culmination under Woodrow Wilson. And as we're going to see, Wilson also very much believes in exporting those progressive era ideals, and specifically the ideal of international peaceful cooperation and democracy abroad. And as a result of this, he, at least in part, he gets the United States involved in World War I to promote those ideals, to try to fight a war, as he said, to make the world safe for democracy, a war to end all wars. So this kind of progressive era idealism very much leads the United States into World War I. And as we're going to see next time, that has some consequences. So what do we see in terms of the fruits of progressivism? Basically, the takeaway here is that progressivism, we see this reform of government and society at all levels. We see women spearheading a lot of this progressive era reform. And as we're going to see, World War I is the thing that kind of ends a lot of this progressive era optimism. And I'll be talking about that in the next lecture.